The record I'm going to read to you is for a period of about 300 years, 750 AD to about 1000 AD, how the popes got to be popes. You can decide whether or not you think these people were righteous and whether or not they were qualified to pass on the teachings of Jesus Christ, and whether or not they were likely to be approved of by God so they could pass on his holy authority to their successors. And I was absolutely flabbergasted by this. I knew it wasn't good news, but I didn't realize as bad as it was. It was written just as a straight historical record. On the death of Pope Paul I, who had attained the pontificate in AD 757, the Duke of Naples compelled some bishops to consecrate Constantine, one of his brothers, as pope, but the more legitimate electors subsequently in AD 768, choosing Stephen IV, the usurper, and his adherents were severely punished. The eyes of Constantine were put out, the tongue of the bishop Theodorus was amputated, and he was left in a dungeon to expire of the agonies of thirst. The nephews of Pope Adrian seized his successor, Pope Leo III, AD 795, in the street, and forcing him into a neighboring church, attempted to put out his eyes and cut out his tongue. At a later period, this pontiff trying to suppress a conspiracy to depose him, Rome became the scene of rebellion, murder, and conflagration. His successor, Stephen V, AD 816, was ignominiously driven from the city. His successor, Paschal I, was accused of blinding and murdering 2 ecclesiastics in the Lateran Palace. It was necessary that imperial commissioners should investigate the matter, but the Pope died after having exculpated himself by oath before 30 bishops. John VIII, AD 872, unable to resist the Mohammedans, was compelled to pay them tribute. The Bishop of Naples, maintaining a secret alliance with the Mohammedans, received his share of the plunder they collected. Him John excommunicated, nor would he give him absolution, forgiveness, unless he should betray the chief Mohammedans and assassinate others himself. There was an ecclesiastical conspiracy to murder the Pope. Some of the treasures of the church were seized, and the gate of St. Pancrazia was opened with false keys to admit the Saracens into the city. Formosus, who had been engaged in these transactions and excommunicated as a conspirator for the murder of John, was subsequently elected Pope in AD 891. He was succeeded by Boniface VI in AD 896, who had been deposed from the diaconate and again from the priesthood for his immoral and lewd life. By Stephen VII, who followed, the dead body of Formosus was taken from the grave, clothed in papal clothing, propped up in a chair, tried before a council, and the preposterous and indecent scene completed by cutting off 3 of the fingers of the corpse and casting the corpse into the Tiber River. But Stephen himself was destined to exemplify how low the papacy had fallen. He was thrown into prison and strangled. In the course of 5 years, from AD 896 to AD 900, 5 popes were consecrated. Leo V, who succeeded in AD 904, was in less than 2 months thrown into prison by Christopher, one of his chaplains, who usurped his place and who in turn was shortly expelled from Rome by Sergius III, who by the aid of a military force seized the pontificate in AD 905. This man, according to the testimony of the times, lived in criminal intercourse with the prostitute Theodora, who with her daughters Marozia and Theodora, also prostitutes, exercised an extraordinary control over him. The love of Theodora was also shared by John X. She gave him first the archbishopric of Ravenna, and then translated him to Rome in AD 915 as pope. John was not unsuited to the times. He organized a confederacy which perhaps prevented Rome from being captured by the Saracens, and the world was astonished and edified by the appearance of this warlike pontiff at the head of his troops. By the love of Theodora, as was said, he had maintained himself in the papacy for 14 years. By the intrigues and hatred of her daughter Marozia, he was overthrown. She surprised him in the Lateran Palace, killed his brother Peter before his face, threw him into prison, where he soon died, smothered, as was asserted, with a pillow. After a short interval, Marozia made her own son pope as John XI in AD 931. Many affirmed that Pope Sergius was his father, but she herself was inclined to attribute him to her husband Alberic, whose father Guido she subsequently married. Another of her sons, Alberic, so called from his supposed father, jealous of his brother John, cast him and their mother Marozia into prison. After a time, Alberic's son was elected pope in AD 956. He assumed the title of John XII, the amorous Marozia thus having given both a son and a grandson to the papacy. John was only 19 years old when he thus became the head of Christendom. His reign was characterized by the most shocking immoralities, so that the Emperor Otho I was compelled by the German clergy to interfere. A synod was summoned for his trial in the Church of St. Peter, before which it appeared that John had received bribes for the consecration of bishops, that he had ordained one who was but 10 years old, and had performed that ceremony over another in a stable. He was charged with incest with one of his father's concubines, and with so many adulteries that the Lateran palace had become a brothel. He put out the eyes of one ecclesiastic and castrated another, both dying in consequence of their injuries. He was given to drunkenness, gambling, and the invocation of Jupiter and Venus. When cited to appear before the council, he sent word that he had gone out hunting. And to the fathers who argued with him, he threateningly remarked that Judas, as well as the other disciples, received from his master the power of binding and loosing, but that as soon as he proved a traitor to the common cause, the only power he retained was that of binding his own neck. Hereupon he was deposed, and Leo VIII elected in his stead in AD 963. But subsequently, getting the upper hand, he seized his antagonists, his enemies, cut off the hand of one, the nose, finger, tongue of others. His life was eventually brought to an end by vengeance of a man whose wife he had seduced. After such details, it is almost needless to allude to the annals of succeeding popes, to relate that John XIII was strangled in prison, that Boniface VII imprisoned Benedict VII and killed him by starvation, that John XIV was secretly put to death in the dungeons of the castle of St. Angelo, that the corpse of Boniface was dragged by the populace through the streets. The sentiment of reverence for the sovereign pontiff, nay, even of respect, had become extinct in Rome. Throughout Europe, the clergy were so shocked at the state of things that in their indignation they began to look with approval, on the intentions of Emperor Otho to take from the Italians their privilege of appointing the successor to St. Peter and confine it to his own family. But his kinsman, Gregory V, whom he placed on the pontifical throne, was very soon compelled by the Romans to fly. His excommunications and religious thunders were turned into derision by them. They were too well acquainted with the true nature of those terrors. They were living behind the scenes. A terrible punishment awaited the anti-pope John XVI. Otho returned into Italy, seized him, put out his eyes, cut off his nose and tongue, and sent him through the streets mounted on an ass with his face to the tail and a wine bladder on his head. It seemed impossible that things could become worse, yet Rome still had to see Benedict IX in AD 1033, a boy of less than 12 years, raised to the apostolic throne. Of this pontiff, one of his successors, Victor III, declared that his life was so shameful, so foul, so execrable that he shuddered to describe it. He ruled like a captain of banditti rather than a prelate. The people at last, unable to bear his adulteries, homicides, and abominations any longer, rose up against him. In despair of maintaining his position, he put up the papacy at auction. It was bought by a presbyter named John, who became Pope Gregory VI in AD 1045. Now, there you have something that should let you know, and this is just straight historical fact. I'm sure that if you looked any of these people up in Wikipedia, you would find that the history was what was stated here. What you did not have here was an orderly, spiritual progression and carrying forward of priesthood honor and authority and spirituality of the leaders of the Catholic Church. And even if Peter had been appointed by the Savior as the bishop in Rome, or he'd become that, which was not the case. That was absolute fraud on the part of the popes. Never happened, because apostles don't serve as bishops. You know what they are. You know that's just plain silliness. These guys certainly didn't pass it on from one to another. It died out. So there was no authority to pass on. Does it sound like any of these guys knew what love and service and forgiveness and understanding and righteousness were? Doesn't really sound like it much to me.